It's an honor to be speaking here at the Old State House. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to Book TV, C-SPAN for joining us here. About 3 weeks into the design of reporting the Revolutionary War, we realized we were on pace to produce an 800-page, 2-inch thick volume. And so we quickly cut corners and retraced our steps and decided to scale back and produce what is now a 400-page full-color book for you. Similarly, I prepared a 5-hour presentation for you this evening and decided to scale that back to a more manageable 45 minutes. So I'll start by saying this. Without newspapers, there would have been no American Revolution. Newspapers are what fanned the flames of rebellion. They sustained loyalty to the cause. They provided critical correspondence during the war, and they ultimately aided in the outcome. Historians know this very well. For 200-plus years, historians have referenced these newspapers in the footnotes of their own analysis and interpretations. What this book does is it inverts the traditional history book, taking those newspapers that have been in the footnotes and placing them at the forefront for general readers like you to enjoy full access to full-color newspapers from the period. So you feel like you're reading over the shoulder of George Washington or Paul Revere. Now, the process for putting this book together was quite a journey for me. I started out as an enthusiast, then became a collector, and then became an educator through a website called raglinen.com, and then ultimately through this book. The story of how I first discovered historic newspapers happened about 5 years ago. My wife and I took our first family vacation to Galena, Illinois, which is a cozy Mississippi River town, where on the main strip there, we discovered a rare bookshop. And in that rare bookshop, I found this kind of nondescript container full of old newspapers. Picked one up and started reading it, and it was the April 21st, 1865 New York Times. I was reading about Abraham Lincoln's assassination and the reward for the capture of his conspirators. That moment triggered in me an intense passion and enthusiasm for history that I previously had never had. So for the next 5 years, it became this journey of meticulous kind of collecting of newspapers because I'm tucked away in the Midwest. I don't have convenient access to a lot of the wonderful archives on the East Coast. I don't have access to a lot of the originals that are found in the libraries and institutions across the country. And so I made it a point to try and collect these because much like any other historical collectible, they're available for sale, for purchase. So if any of you have ever seen American Pickers on History Channel, I would say it's much like that. I would equate myself to American Pickers, but more along the lines of historic documents, newspapers, where I am traversing the earth trying to find and locate and pick newspapers out of rare bookshops and European book dealers and people who've discovered them in attics and behind walls of old homes. So it's an exciting discovery process. And these newspapers eventually grew and accumulated to where they became a significant collection, one of the most significant private collections of American Revolution era newspapers. And the story it told, or they told, is fascinating, one that deserves to be shared and with the general readership, which this book hopefully accomplishes. So tonight, what I want to do is kind of walk you through what I would consider to be the 4 buckets of discoveries that I've made along this journey. And I categorize those buckets as one being the old media versus new, the journalism discoveries, the history discoveries, and then what I would call paper and preservation discoveries. So we'll start with old media versus new. Quantity. Today we're looking at practically limitless sources of news. Television, radio, internet, social media, Twitter, you name it, you have access to a seemingly unlimited quantity of news sources. Back then, newspapers were the only mass media of the day. The first newspaper printed on American soil successfully was the Boston Newsletter in 1704. It wasn't until 15 years later that we had the second American newspaper printed, also in Boston, the Boston Gazette. Coincidentally, the next day, the third newspaper started in Philadelphia, the American Weekly Mercury. Circulation. The top 100 newspapers in America, average circulation is approximately 200,000. At the time of the American Revolution, the average circulation was approximately 600. Now that sounds awfully low, but keep in mind that these newspapers were also read aloud in taverns and meeting houses and private homes. And so while subscribership or circulation might be low, actual readership is quite significant. Distribution. We have internet, we have telephone, TV and radio today. Back then, distribution of newspapers was done primarily through horseback and ship, commonly called packet boats. The time lag. Today, news is instantaneous. It's on demand. You can flip open your phone and have almost real-time news at your fingertips. 200 plus years ago, the news came weekly, the news came weekly, and so the time lag, where you would open up a newspaper and you would find news that was anywhere from a day old to several months old. A large part of that was just the amount of transit time that had to go into, how far the news traveled to reach that colonial printer. So for instance, you might have news coming from across the Atlantic, in which case the average transatlantic voyage is 4 to 8 weeks. The length of these newspapers. Today we have newspapers that are roughly about 20 to 30 pages, multiple sections. Back then the average newspaper was 4 pages long. So picture one large sheet of paper. That one large sheet of paper, on one side of that were pages 1 and 4. So the front and the back page of the newspaper, then folded in half, and on the inside you would have pages 2 and 3. So what we think of today as kind of, backtrack. The front page and the fourth page were typically typeset earlier in the week, whereas the interior pages, pages 2 and 3, were typeset later in the week or more closer to the actual publication date. So what we would associate as being front page cover story news was typically found on page 2 or 3, not on page 1 and 4, where you would have more of the evergreen type of content, so foreign news, essays, advertisements, and such. The frequency, we talked about how today we have the daily and the instant news. Back then you had weekly. Bias. Today we have left and right-leaning media. Back then you had patriot and loyalist newspapers. It was very important to me that this book include both perspectives of patriot and loyalists, as well as American and British newspapers. This takes us to the journalism discoveries. Today, newspapers have paid professional staffs of reporters and editors. Back then, they didn't have professional paid staffs. The #1 news source was private correspondence. So here we have an early 1774 Pennsylvania newspaper that has an article that starts off with letters from Boston complaining much of the taste of their fish being altered, which would suggest a humorous take on the Boston Tea Party. What you will find most commonly is this extract of a letter from to lead into the articles of the day. You'll also note there weren't headlines. Headlines weren't very common in the 18th century, and so most of the articles back then would lead with extract of a letter from or a dateline. Another primary news source was the exchange system or other newspapers. So once a colonial printer would print their weekly edition, they would send issues up and down the continent to the other colonial